Margaret Brennan is at the White House. Margaret, yesterday we heard about the military campaign against ISIS in Syria and Iraq from a very aggressive President Obama. But what is the administration's strategy for preventing future attacks here on U.S. soil?
Well, you heard the president lay out his strategy to attack ISIS in its heartland of Syria, as well as the battlegrounds of Iraq and elsewhere in Libya. You're going to hear later this week from the president when he visits the National Counterterrorism Center. He's really drawing the focus on trying to prevent radicalization and infiltration here in the United States. That's really reliance on the intelligence community. You also heard a ramping up of what Homeland Security is doing in terms of trying to raise scrutiny if there are incidents that should be watched and perhaps trigger some of those tripwires so that the intelligence community is monitoring people who could be possibly a threat to security here at home.
You know, Margaret, some GOP candidates have certainly used anti-Muslim, anti-immigration rhetoric when talking about the fight against ISIS. President Obama has certainly expressed how he finds this sort of language distasteful. But what is the White House doing to counteract those sentiments?
Well, Muslim American community leaders were invited here to the White House yesterday to meet with senior aides to the president. Later this morning, the president himself will go attend a swearing-in ceremony for new citizens. This is the White House really sort of drawing a stark contrast between some of the anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim rhetoric that they have raised concerns about, saying that this kind of backlash actually is a threat to national security. You want to make the Muslim community here at home feel invested in improving security and raise red flags, feel safe enough to be able to do that. And when that community begins to feel under attack, it counteracts that, as well as lending to the rhetoric of ISIS itself and its attempts to recruit by drawing this false idea of the U.S. at war with Islam.
Margaret, let's talk about the strategy since San Bernardino. We know that Tashfeen Malik posted about violent jihad on social media before she was granted a visa, but we know she also went through a fairly intensive vetting process. So what does that say about the vetting process? And are you hearing that at some point the government may start to look at people's social media accounts who are trying to enter the country?
Yes, well, what it says is that the vetting process hasn't kept up with the times. Social media posts aren't necessarily included in the background checks for people who aren't raising any other red flags. That was the case with Tashfeen Malik. And you're hearing now from the White House that they're ordering the Department of Homeland Security and the State Department together to review some of the loopholes here. Social media is part of that scrutiny. This is actually kind of a messy area to get into, though, because not only are there concerns about freedom of speech, but also how you begin to vet this. White House spokesperson Josh Earnest said yesterday that it's also a question of resources. How do you go out there and troll the internet looking for posts that could be under pseudonyms, posts that could be just a conviction about what's happening overseas, not necessarily something saying you're going to act on that sentiment. So it's a really messy area that the Department of Homeland Security and their lawyers are trying to hammer out right now. How do you comb through that vast array of information online, and how do you work that into a process that already is quite bulky? You already have facial recognition, fingerprinting that happens, face-to-face interviews, an electronic questionnaire called the DS-160 that someone like Tashfeen Malik had to sit down, fill out, and go through and pass in order to come to this country.
All right, Margaret Brennan, thank you very much.